What if I told you there was a man who could write a letter to the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe, and tell him, "You would not have your crown without me. Pay what you owe or face the consequences." And the emperor, a man who commanded armies across continents, who held dominion over millions, who was considered by many to be God's representative on earth, had no choice but to comply. That man wasn't a king, he wasn't a general, he wasn't even born into nobility. He was a banker. His name was Jakob Fugger, and at the height of his power, his personal wealth would translate to roughly $400 billion in today's money. To put that in perspective, that would make him wealthier than Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates combined. But Jakob Fugger wasn't just rich. Rich people existed throughout history. What made Fugger different was power. Real, tangible, world-shaping power. He decided who became emperor. He influenced papal policy. He controlled the resources that determined which nations could wage war and which could not. He was, in every meaningful sense, the ruler of Europe. And yet, most people today have never heard his name. This is the story of how a man from a family of peasant weavers became the most powerful financier in history, how he perfected the art of political manipulation through money, how he ended the Catholic Church's ban on charging interest, fundamentally changing how capitalism works, and how his actions, intended solely to enrich himself, accidentally triggered one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, the 30 Years' War, which would kill roughly 8 million people. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about what happens when one person accumulates so much financial power that they can bend kings, popes, and empires to their will. And it's a warning about what that kind of power can destroy. Let's start at the very beginning. Because the Fugger family's story doesn't begin with wealth or privilege, it begins with a peasant weaver named Hans Fugger, working the fields in a small village in Swabia, in what is now southern Germany. Hans was nobody, a farmer, a tradesman, the kind of person history usually forgets. But Hans had something that separated him from other peasants: ambition. And more importantly, he was willing to take risks to escape. In medieval Europe, if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. The social structure was rigid. Your station in life was determined by birth, and there was... But Hans saw an opportunity. He migrated from his village to the city of Augsburg, leaving behind the oppressive rule of rural nobles for the relative freedom of urban life. In the city, Hans worked as a tradesman, learning the textile business. And here's where his strategy gets interesting. He married a guildmaster's daughter. Actually, he did this twice, after his first wife died. These weren't just romantic decisions. They were calculated moves. By marrying into guild families, Hans gained civic rights, freedom of commerce, and access to networks that would have been impossible for a peasant to reach otherwise. Hans worked relentlessly. He became a member of the guild's committee, then joined the city's great council. By the time he died, he'd completely transformed his family's status. He wasn't nobility, but he wasn't a peasant anymore either. He was a successful merchant, and he'd laid the foundation for something far greater. Hans had a son, Jakob Fugger I. Now, to avoid confusion, let me clarify. There were two Jakob Fuggers in this family. Jakob I was Hans's son. Jakob II, who we're really here to talk about, was Jakob I's youngest son. But we need to understand Jakob I because he's the one who took his father's modest success and turned it into real wealth. Jakob I learned from the failures of his relatives. He watched other families squander their fortunes through hasty decisions, bad investments, and poor risk management, and he decided he would never make those mistakes. His approach was methodical, cautious, calculated. He diversified. He spread risk. He tried every business that had proven successful, from textiles to spices to jewels, even trading in religious relics like martyrs' bones and fragments of crosses. And it worked. By 1463, Jakob I became a full member of the Merchants' Guild, a sign that he'd achieved elite status among Augsburg's business community. He fathered 11 children, and when he died, he left them a highly functioning business empire. But here's where the story gets interesting. Because of those 11 children, the youngest son, Jakob II, was the one destined to take the family to unimaginable heights. And, ironically, he never wanted any of it. Jakob II wanted to be a priest, maybe even a cardinal. He was drawn to religious life, to scholarship, to the church. If history had gone differently, we might be talking about Cardinal Jakob Fugger, a footnote in Vatican history. But his older brothers had other plans. They saw something in young Jakob that he perhaps didn't see in himself, a natural talent for numbers, for strategy, for understanding how money moves and how power works. So they convinced him, probably pressured him, to join the family business, and they sent him to Venice. This is crucial. Venice in the late 1400s was the financial capital of Europe. It was where modern banking was being invented. Double-entry bookkeeping, sophisticated credit instruments, international trade networks, all of this was being developed and refined in Venice. Sending Jakob there was like sending someone to Silicon Valley in the 1990s to learn about the internet. He was being trained at the cutting edge of financial innovation. Jakob studied modern bookkeeping starting in 1478. He learned Italian financial practices, he absorbed everything about banking, trade, and credit. And when he returned to Augsburg in his mid-20s, he was given control of the family agency in Innsbruck, Austria. And this is where Jakob Fugger II began to show that he was nothing like his father or his brothers. Jakob I had been cautious, methodical, risk-averse. Jakob II was the opposite. He was intelligent, yes, but he was also daring, aggressive, willing to make bets that terrified everyone around him. And his first major gamble was audacious to the point of recklessness. He decided to target the patronage of Archduke Sigismund of Habsburg. Now, Sigismund was notorious throughout Europe, not for his military prowess or his political skill, but for his extravagant lifestyle and catastrophic financial management. This was a man who spent money like water on elaborate parties, on spectacles, on absurd displays of wealth. There's one infamous event where he had a dwarf jump out of a pie to wrestle a giant. That gives you a sense of how Sigismund operated. Sigismund financed this lifestyle by taking out massive loans and then defaulting on them repeatedly. His credit was destroyed. Every major banker in Europe had learned the hard way not to lend to Sigismund. He was financial poison. So naturally, Jakob Fugger decided to lend him money. Where everyone else saw a disaster waiting to happen, Jakob saw opportunity. He didn't lend Sigismund huge sums at first. He made a small loan, just enough to establish a relationship. But that relationship was everything. Because Sigismund, despite his personal incompetence, was a Habsburg. He was connected to one of the most powerful noble families in Europe. And more importantly, he controlled access to something Jakob desperately wanted: mining rights. Mining in the 15th century was dominated by nobility. Commoners, no matter how wealthy, couldn't just start digging for silver and copper. You needed permission, licenses, access. And Jakob had none of that. But by becoming Sigismund's banker, he could potentially gain entry to an industry that would make his family's wealth explode. And then came Jakob's defining moment, the gamble that would make or break everything. Sigismund got into a military conflict with Venice. Venice was far more powerful, and the war was going badly. Sigismund was desperate for money to pay his troops, to buy supplies, to continue fighting. And every major banker in Europe refused to lend to him. His credit was worthless. He was finished. Jakob Fugger stepped in with an offer that stunned everyone. He would lend Sigismund 100,000 florins. In today's money, that's tens of millions of dollars. It was an enormous sum, possibly more than the entire Fugger family fortune at the time. Other bankers thought Jakob had lost his mind. They were convinced he'd never see a penny of that money back. Sigismund's track record was crystal clear. He didn't pay his debt. But Jakob wasn't stupid. He didn't just hand over the money. He structured the loan with brutal terms. Sigismund couldn't repay it with silver from his mines. Instead, Jakob demanded control of the state treasury. Essentially, he wanted to become Sigismund's finance minister, with the power to collect revenues directly. And then, something incredible happened. Wagons loaded with silver from Sigismund's mines began rolling up to Fugger warehouses. The loan was being repaid. Not just repaid, Jakob was making enormous profits from the interest, and from the control he now had over Tyrolean finances. The gamble had paid off spectacularly. Jakob Fugger was now far wealthier than before. But more importantly, he'd established himself as a trusted financier to the Habsburg family, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. And Jakob wasn't done. He leveraged his relationship with Sigismund to gain access to mining operations across the region. In Silesia, he met mining experts and used their knowledge to identify and test copper mines. In Schwaz, in Tyrol, Sigismund gave Jakob access to the mother of all silver mines. Under Jakob's leadership, Schwaz transformed into the largest mining metropolis in the world during the first half of the 16th century. People flocked there for work. The Fugger family's industrial operations were unlike anything Europe had seen. And here's why this mattered beyond just wealth. Copper was essential for making cannons and bayonets, the weapons that determined the outcome of wars. Jakob Fugger now had near monopolistic control over a resource that every European power needed. He could set prices, he could control supply, and armies couldn't fight without his cooperation. To scale operations even further, the Fuggers established what many historians consider the first public company in 1494, with a capital of 54,000 guilders. Just 2 years later, Jakob doubled this by convincing the Prince Bishop of Brixen to join as a silent partner. Jakob's vision was clear: create a copper monopoly and become the richest man in Europe, possibly the world. He expanded aggressively, opening foundries across Central Europe. He focused particularly on the family's agency in Antwerp, which was becoming a major trading hub between Europe, Asia, and the New World. The Fuggers became the unofficial rulers of Antwerp's financial markets. And then Jakob learned a lesson that would define the rest of his career. His chief creditor, the Prince Bishop of Brixen, died, and the Pope claimed the inheritance, just took it. Millions of florins that should have gone to repaying the Fuggers were instead seized by the Vatican. Now, most businessmen would have been ruined by this. A debt that large simply erased by papal decree, with no legal recourse. But Jakob didn't panic. He negotiated. He leveraged his growing network of contacts within the Vatican. He made deals, probably offered incentives we'll never know about. And somehow, he protected the Fugger family's interests. But more importantly, Jakob learned something that changed his entire worldview. Power is everything. Money without power is vulnerable. But if you have power, you can take money. You can erase debts. You can rewrite rules. From that moment on, Jakob Fugger stopped thinking like a merchant and started thinking like a kingmaker. His first major move was brutal and calculated. He abandoned his old patron, Sigismund, and aligned himself with Sigismund's cousin, Maximilian, who was positioning himself to become Holy Roman Emperor. When Maximilian threatened to seize power if Sigismund didn't repay his debt, Jakob could have stepped in to help Sigismund. After all, Sigismund had given Jakob his start. But Jakob preferred Maximilian. Maximilian was competent, ambitious, and more importantly, he was going to win. So Jakob financed Maximilian's efforts to take Vienna. And when Maximilian succeeded, he rewarded Jakob with access to Hungary, a key region for copper mining. Jakob reconfigured Hungary's mines and expanded his mining empire even further. In 1507, Jakob acquired the lordships of Kirchberg and Weissenhorn from Maximilian. The Fuggers were now counted among high-ranking nobles, at least in terms of land ownership, if not official title. But Jakob's influence didn't go unnoticed. Other bankers, jealous of his success, pressured Maximilian to cut Fugger out of future deals. And here's where Jakob showed just how powerful he'd become. He used his connections to pressure influential dukes and bishops, who, in turn, forced Maximilian to relent and keep working with the Fuggers. Jakob had more political leverage than the emperor's other advisors. In 1514, Maximilian officially recognized Jakob's power by making him a count, a high-ranking noble position. Maximilian had every reason to stay on Jakob's good side. Jakob was literally his most valuable ally and chief financial supporter, and as Maximilian's health declined, he needed Jakob's goodwill to secure the throne for his chosen successor, Charles I of Habsburg. And here we come to one of the most audacious regulations in history. When Maximilian died, there was an election for Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't a hereditary position automatically passed down. Electors, powerful princes and bishops, voted on who would become emperor. And Charles I, Maximilian's grandson, was one candidate. His main rival was Francis I of France. The election came down to money. Whoever could pay the electors more would win. Jakob Fugger raised 543,000 guilders of the 852,000 guilders needed for Charles's success. That's roughly 64% of the total election expenses. Jakob Fugger personally financed the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. Think about what that means. The most powerful political position in Europe was decided not by military might, not by bloodline, not by divine right, but by a banker's money. And Charles I knew it. He was now Emperor Charles V, ruling over an empire that stretched from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to southern Italy. He held 81 titles, including King of Spain, King of Jerusalem, and Holy Roman Emperor. People considered him quasi-divine, and he owed his crown to Jakob Fugger. But Jakob wasn't satisfied with controlling just one side of the political aisle. He was a long-term strategist. He knew that putting all his influence behind Charles was risky. So he made alliances with other powerful nobles as counterweights, including King Henry VIII of England. Jakob ensured that the Fugger family's power extended far beyond the Holy Roman Empire, and then Jakob turned his attention to Rome. He took over the transfer of donations from Germany to Rome, earning him the title God's Banker. He became the top financier of the Vatican. He even paid the Swiss mercenaries who protected the Pope, establishing the tradition of the Swiss Papal Guard that continues to this day. The Fuggers became responsible for handling remittances to the papal court. They managed funds from the sale of indulgences, those controversial certificates that supposedly absolved people of sin. From 1508 to 1515, the Fuggers leased the Roman Mint, embedding their influence even deeper into Vatican financial operations. Jakob Fugger served 7 popes and minted coins for 4 of them. His financial acumen funded significant projects, including the Sistine Chapel. He was an architect of Europe's financial and religious landscape. Jakob Fugger was now a man with immense influence over both the emperor and the pope, political power and spiritual authority. He could dictate laws and policies with almost no opposition. A man of peasant origins had achieved a level of power that even the greatest kings commanding vast armies could not match. In 1510, Jakob's brother Ulrich died, leaving Jakob as sole head of all Fugger business operations. He became the undisputed master of European finance, wielding influence that would shape the continent's history for decades. And here's where Jakob's power became truly frightening. Because historic events were now being driven by his business interests, not by kings or generals.
For example, Jakob dictated to Emperor Maximilian that he should pursue a marriage alliance with Hungary. This wasn't about love or politics in the traditional sense, it was about protecting Fugger mining interests in Hungary, and it redrew the map of Europe, creating the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Two states merged, creating better defense against the Ottoman Empire. But for Jakob, this was just about protecting his assets. Meanwhile, in Rome, Jakob was instrumental in ending the church's century-long ban on usury, the practice of charging interest on loans. For centuries, the Catholic Church had declared that charging interest was a sin, but Jakob, in alliance with other powerful merchants, urged the Pope to repeal this ban, and the Pope did it. This was a breakthrough for capitalism. It accelerated debt financing and set the stage for the modern economy. Before this, lending was limited because you couldn't profit from it directly. After this, banking exploded as an industry. At the height of his power, Jakob could threaten the most powerful nobles in Europe if they fell behind on debt payments. And in 1523, he did exactly that. He wrote a letter to Emperor Charles V, not a polite request, a demand. Here's what it said. "It is well known that your imperial majesty would not have acquired the imperial crown without my help. You must calculate the money you owe me and pay me without further delay." Read that again. Jakob Fugger, a banker, wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, and essentially said, "You owe me your throne. Pay up or else." And Charles paid, because Jakob wasn't bluffing. If Jakob decided to cut off Charles's credit, the emperor couldn't pay his armies, couldn't fund his wars, couldn't maintain his empire. Jakob's financial power was greater than Charles's political and military power. This is the moment where it becomes crystal clear. Money had become the ultimate form of power. Not armies, not crowns, not divine right. Money. But Jakob's story takes a dark turn here, because his greatest contribution to history was something he never intended: the Protestant Reformation. The Fugger family's involvement in the sale of indulgences drew intense criticism. An increasing number of people saw the Vatican as having sold itself to a greedy merchant. There were even accusations that the Fugger family had made a pact with the devil. And a priest named Martin Luther was watching all of this with growing disgust. Let me explain what indulgences were, because it's important to understand why people were so angry. The Catholic Church sold certificates that supposedly absolved individuals from sin, or reduced their time in purgatory. You could literally buy your way out of divine punishment. It was seen by many as exploiting people's fear of damnation for financial gain. And Jakob Fugger was managing the money from these sales. In 1517, Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, challenging the Church's practices. Luther's criticism went viral, spreading across Europe thanks to the recently invented printing press. And it sparked religious and social upheaval that would reshape the continent. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just about theology. It was about corruption, about power, about the concentration of wealth and influence in the hands of people like Jakob Fugger and the Pope he controlled. People also held grievances against the Fuggers for pushing the Pope to legalize usury. While this helped businesses for the wealthy, it also enabled predatory lending practices that trapped the poor in cycles of debt. The ability to charge interest made loans more accessible, but it also created widespread debt bondage. This worsened social inequalities and created resentment toward the three main figures people blamed: the Pope, the Emperor, and Jakob Fugger. The far-reaching effects of Fugger's financial strategies ultimately sowed the seeds for the 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history. This war, born from the Reformation, would lead to unimaginable loss and suffering. Estimates suggest that roughly 20% of Europe's population died during the 30 Years' War. Some regions experienced population declines of up to 60%. 8 million people dead, entire cities destroyed, economies shattered. And while Jakob Fugger didn't cause this war directly, his actions, his manipulation of the church, his concentration of power, created the conditions that made it possible. So who was Jakob Fugger as a person? What kind of man accumulates this much power and wealth? Surprisingly, despite being one of the wealthiest men in history, Jakob lived simply. He wasn't interested in luxury for its own sake. He didn't throw lavish parties like Sigismund. He didn't build palaces or indulge in excess. His focus was singular, expanding his business and reshaping Europe's financial system. In his own words, "I want to gain while I can." Jakob's greatest asset was his willpower. He faced constant challenges, legal actions by governments, social unrest among miners, Hungarian nobles trying to nationalize the mines, a peasants' revolt, an uprising of artisans in his hometown of Augsburg. Through all of it, Jakob persevered through sheer tenacity. But there was one challenge that haunted him until his death: the Reformation. The Reformation undermined everything Jakob had built. The Catholic Church had been crucial to his banking empire. As the Reformation challenged the Church's authority, it destabilized the entire system Jakob depended on. And there was widespread criticism of figures like him who had contributed to church corruption. Jakob fought against the Reformation. He stood firm in his beliefs, tried to protect the legacy he'd built, but his aging body couldn't keep up with the strain. He died in the winter of 1525, only 66 years old. His empire was bequeathed to his nephew, Anton Fugger, since Jakob himself never had children. Jakob Fugger's financial acumen and political influence led to a permanent shift in European history. If the Medici family in Italy was responsible for the birth of modern banking, it was Jakob Fugger who perfected it. He didn't just accumulate wealth, he weaponized it. He transformed the economic landscape of Europe. He influenced the political and social fabric of entire nations. His control over vital resources like silver and copper, his pivotal role in financing emperors and popes, gave him unprecedented power over the continent's affairs. But it also played a significant role in some of Europe's darkest chapters. Economic disparities grew. Social discontent festered. Religious conflict exploded into violence, and millions died. So what's the lesson here? What does Jakob Fugger's story teach us about money, power, and history? First, it shows us that power doesn't always come from the places we expect. Jakob wasn't born into nobility. He wasn't a military genius. He didn't inherit political authority. He simply understood something fundamental. In a complex society, money is leverage, and leverage is power. Second, it demonstrates the danger of concentrated financial power. When one person controls resources that entire nations depend on, when one banker can decide who becomes emperor, that person isn't just wealthy, they're a systemic risk. Because their decisions, made for personal profit, affect millions of people who have no say in those decisions. Third, it reminds us that actions have consequences that ripple far beyond their intended purpose. Jakob wanted to make money. That's all. He wasn't trying to start a religious war. He wasn't trying to kill 8 million people. He was just trying to gain while he could. But by manipulating the church, by pushing for the legalization of usury, by concentrating so much power in his own hands, he created instability. And that instability exploded. The Reformation wasn't inevitable. The 30 Years' War wasn't predetermined. But they became more likely because of the system Jakob helped build. A system where money could buy salvation, where debt could trap entire populations, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few individuals who owed allegiance to no nation and answered to no authority, except profit. Jakob Fugger died in 1525, but his legacy lived on.
The Fugger family remained influential for generations.
Anton Fugger, Jakob's nephew and successor, continued the business successfully. The family's wealth persisted for centuries, but they never again reached the heights Jakob achieved. Because Jakob's power was unique to his moment in history, he lived at a time when financial systems were being invented, when nation-states were still forming, when the church's authority was starting to crack but hadn't yet shattered. He operated in the gaps, in the spaces between old medieval structures and the modern world being born. And in those gaps, he built an empire of money that controlled kings. Today, we live in a world Jakob Fugger helped create. A world where interest on loans is normal, where debt finances governments and corporations, where wealth can translate into political power, where bankers, not soldiers, often decide the fate of nations. We've built regulations, laws, democratic institutions meant to prevent any one person from accumulating the kind of power Jakob wielded. But the question remains, have we succeeded? Or have we just made the power more diffuse, more hidden, more sophisticated? Because the lesson of Jakob Fugger is simple and terrifying. Money is power. Real, tangible, world-shaping power. And those who control money can control everything else, whether we see it happening or not. Jakob Fugger understood this 500 years ago, and nothing fundamental has changed since then. The game is the same, or different. History has the answers. We just have to decide whether we're willing to learn from them. Because if we don't, we might find ourselves repeating the same mistakes, building the same concentrations of power, creating the same instabilities that led to centuries of conflict. Jakob Fugger gained while he could, and in doing so, he changed the world. Whether that change was for better or worse depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain: the consequences of his actions echoed for centuries, and they're still echoing today.